was flowing and no one saw any wounds, but he felt every pain as if he were on the cross. Padre Pio did not just talk about Christ, he carried Christ, the wounds, the crown, the invisible weight of Calvary. While celebrating Mass, time seemed to stand still. The scent of roses, voices in tongues he had never learned, bilocations, healings, and the gaze that saw the entire soul. Hardened men collapsed at his feet, sterile women returned with children in their arms, and even today, thousands claim he continues to heal. But what few know is the price he paid for each miracle, for the sleepless nights, for the visits from the devil, for the love that consumed him in silence. You will now meet the saint who bled with Jesus and who still extends a hand to those who cry out for mercy. Chapter 1. Childhood and God's Calling. The warm breeze of the hills of Pietrelcina blew over the golden fields of southern Italy when, on May 25, 1887, a frail boy with deep brown eyes like wells of silence was born. Francesco Forgione came into the world in a simple home, the son of poor farmers, but with fervent faith. His parents, Grazio and Maria Giuseppa, could hardly foresee that their shy son would carry the marks of Christ on his body. The house was humble, with cold stone walls and a worn wooden altar with the image of the Virgin. From a young age, Francesco showed an uncommon sensitivity to sacred things. While other children ran through the fields, he liked to take refuge behind the small church of Santa Anna. There, kneeling on hard stones, he spent long moments in silent prayer, as if he were listening to something that no one else could hear. At 5 years old, he had his first vision, something he would only reveal decades later. He frequently saw Jesus and Mary as naturally as one talks to their parents. He also saw the ugly things, as he called the demons that tried to torment him from an early age. The frail boy faced nights of sweat and tremors, his voice softly echoing prayers taught by his mother. But he never gave up. He told his mother not to be afraid. He had already asked the guardian angel to protect him. The Forgione family was marked by poverty. To support Francesco's religious studies, his father Grazio emigrated to the United States, a silent and sacrificial act of love. He worked as a laborer in unfamiliar fields to ensure that his son could dedicate himself to God. It was an effort that brought tears to his mother's eyes, who remained alone with the other children, and a longing that ached in her chest. At just 10 years old, Francesco already knew he wanted to be a Capuchin friar. He listened attentively to the stories of the saints and was enchanted by the life of poverty and penance of Saint Francis of Assisi. He did not want fame, he did not want possessions, he only wanted to hide in the mantle of God. At 14, after much insistence, he was accepted by the Capuchin friars of Morcone. But there was an obstacle: his fragile health. He was often ill. He had unexplained fevers, stomach pains, crises that doctors could not cure, but he endured everything in silence. When he began his novitiate in January 1903, he received the name Brother Pio in honor of St. Pius V, and wore the brown habit of the Capuchins with trembling hands, but eyes fixed on the sky. He was thin, pale, with a serenity that impressed the older ones. Life in the convent was not easy. The cold cut through the skin, the meals were scarce, and silence was mandatory. But Brother Pio accepted everything with gratitude. He slept little, ate even less, and spent hours in contemplation, even when his body begged for rest. Some brothers began to notice that he spoke to himself at night, sometimes in tears, sometimes smiling, as if contemplating something celestial. During one of those nights, still a teenager, he had a vision of Jesus crowned with thorns, who asked him, "Do you want to participate in my passion?" He accepted. It was the beginning of a journey marked by the mystery of redemptive pain. By the end of this chapter of his youth, Brother Pio was no longer just a young religious. He was someone deeply united to the supernatural, with a heart willing to sacrifice, a soul touched by God and marked by spiritual battles that would come with even greater force. And even though he did not know it, his cross was already being shaped, invisible but present, in the silence of the cold cells and in the warmth of incessant prayer. Chapter 2. Monastic Life and Early Trials. When Brother Pio donned the brown habit of the Capuchins, the smell of coarse wool and incense embedded in the fibers became part of his new body. The cell was simple: a wooden bed, a small cross above, the straw pillow, and a silence that weighed on his chest like an invisible mantle. It was there that his life of total consecration began, and of constant struggle with the fragility of the body. The routine was rigorous. The friars woke before the sun at 4 in the morning, with the ringing of the bell cutting through the cold air of the stone corridors. There was communal prayer, meditation, manual labor, studies of theology and Latin, and the Spartan meals: a thin soup, a piece of hard bread, a little wine. But Brother Pio did not complain. He wanted to suffer. He wanted to carry the cross. With a fervor that frightened even the most pious, he desired to unite himself with the crucified Christ. It was during this period that his already fragile health began to fail even more severely. He had violent fever crises, accompanied by coughs and stomach pains that left him prostrate. The heat burned his skin as if there were fire inside. Sometimes he could not even stand for prayers. The doctors were confused. Nothing seemed to explain the symptoms, and nothing could cure him. Nevertheless, he dragged himself to the chapel. One night, he was found kneeling barefoot on the stone floor, trembling with fever and prayer, with his eyes fixed on the crucifix as if he were facing an eternal secret. His superiors, moved by his perseverance, decided to allow him to return to Pietrelcina for a time, to try to recover with the fresh air of the countryside and the care of his mother. There, among the olive trees and the smell of baked bread coming from the simple houses, Brother Pio maintained a routine of prayer so intense that even the local parish priest testified, "He prays more than he lives." He seems to talk to God as one speaks to an old friend. It was during this period of convalescence that the spiritual phenomena that would accompany him throughout his life began to intensify. He experienced ecstasies during prayer, celestial visions, and demonic attacks that left him exhausted. One night, screams were heard from his room. When his father broke down the door, he found him injured, with marks on his back and chest. "They did it," he whispered, his eyes still in a trance. "They came again, but I did not give in." Despite the frequent relapses, Brother Pio insisted on continuing his formation. It was as if a supernatural force sustained him. In August 1910, at the age of 23, even with the doctors worried, he was ordained a priest at the Cathedral of Benevento. He wore borrowed vestments and trembling hands, but his gaze was firm, transfigured. At that moment, as he pronounced for the first time the words of consecration, "This is my body," something happened. A warmth flooded his chest, and tears fell silently down his face. There was a fragrance in the air, a soft aroma of roses and incense that some present noticed but could not explain. After the ordination, he returned again to Pietrelcina to continue his treatment. He was a priest, yes, but he could not yet live in community like the other friars. It was a silent cross. He celebrated Mass alone in the small church of the village, in front of a few parishioners, with a solemnity that impressed even the simplest, and each Mass was a Calvary. He spoke slowly, as if he carried each word in his body. Sometimes he stopped for entire minutes before the altar, eyes misty, hands trembling. "Jesus is here," he murmured, "suffering with me." In this phase of life, Brother Pio experienced solitude as a school of holiness. He was separated from the community, caught between frail health and mystical experiences he did not know how to explain. But there, in the hiding place of God, he began to be shaped as an instrument of something much greater. This time of suffering was in fact a refinement of his soul. The physical pain was constant, but his surrender was even firmer. The young priest, who could barely stand, was about to become a giant of faith. And although no one knew it yet, the first traces of a life marked by the supernatural were already imprinted not only in his spirit, but also, in a mysterious way, in his body. Chapter 3. The Retreat and the First Signs of the Supernatural. The silent mountains of southern Italy surrounded the little town of Pietrelcina with an almost supernatural calm. It was in this refuge that Brother Pio, already ordained a priest, lived isolated from the other friars. The convent, by medical recommendation, was not the ideal environment for his fragile health. Therefore, for many long years, he remained in his hometown, celebrating Mass, hearing confessions, and fighting day and night against nameless pains and invisible torments. Externally, life seemed calm, but inside, Brother Pio lived in turmoil. When the windows closed and the last church bell fell silent, he fought battles that few could imagine. The stomach pains made him scream. High fevers came for no reason. The doctors, astonished, began to consider that it was not just a physical case. There was something that escaped the understanding of science. But more frightening than the illness was what was happening in his soul. During prayer, Brother Pio would enter states of ecstasy. He would remain motionless for hours, eyes turned to the invisible, lips murmuring prayers as if conversing with heaven. Once, he was found kneeling, arms outstretched in the shape of a cross, his face illuminated by a faint light that no one knew the source of. When he came to himself, he was crying, "He was here, Jesus," so close that I could feel him touching me. During this time of retreat, supernatural experiences intensified. Visions of the child Jesus, the Virgin Mary, angels, and saints became frequent. But the attacks from the enemy also intensified. One dawn, residents heard screams coming from the Forgione house. When they opened Brother Pio's bedroom door, they found him unconscious, with furniture overturned and scratches on his back. "They came to beat me," he said upon regaining consciousness. "But I prayed with all my strength. Despite everything, he never lost his gentleness. With each new suffering, he said, 'If Jesus gives me this cross, it is because he knows I can carry it.' He never complained, he never asked for relief, just strength not to give up. It was during this period that the first signs of the stigmata began, still invisible. He felt sharp pains in his hands, feet, and side, as if nails were piercing his flesh. He hid this even from his parents. Once, a friend saw his hands covered with cloths. It was a cut, Brother Pio said, looking away. But the truth was different. He felt the wounds of the Passion of Christ pulsing within him. A doctor, upon examining him, suggested it might be hysteria. But Brother Pio, with a serene gaze, replied, "I am not the one seeking this. He chose me. And if it is to suffer in silence, so be it." It was a pain that could not be seen, but that consumed the body. A hidden wound but alive, like an ember within the flesh. In this isolation, he began to write spiritual letters to his director, Father Agostino. In them, he humbly narrated the ecstasies, the pains, and the mystical phenomena. He asked for discernment. He wanted to know if this truly came from God or if it was a temptation. The letters reveal a tormented heart, yet completely surrendered to divine will. The time in Pietrelcina was long. From 1910 to 1916, Brother Pio lived there as an exile from the world. But this exile sanctified him. His fame for holiness began to spread discreetly. Peasants came to seek advice. The sick asked for his prayers. and everyone left touched, as if they had been in the presence of something more than human. But heaven had other plans. In July 1916, his superiors, noticing a slight improvement in his health, transferred him to an isolated convent called San Giovanni Rotondo, a village hidden high in the mountains, surrounded by mist and silence. It seemed like any other place, but there, far from the eyes of the world, the wounds that until then burned invisibly would become visible, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 4. The manifestation of the visible stigmas. The road winding to San Giovanni Rotondo was rocky and almost deserted. In 1916, that village nestled in the Gargano Mountains was merely a forgotten point on the map, inhabited by humble peasants and low clouds that covered the sky like a mourning veil. When Brother Pio arrived at the small convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, the silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the ringing of bells and the wind whispering through the olive trees. The building was modest, with whitewashed walls and cold cells, but Brother Pio felt at home. "Here, hidden from everything, I can die and be reborn," he said to the first brother who welcomed him. He had no idea that on this ground he would carve a story that the whole world would come to behold. At first, his presence did not attract attention. He celebrated Mass with profound devotion, spent hours before the tabernacle, and walked with dragging steps through the cloister, the rosary between his fingers and his gaze always fixed above. But as the days passed, something strange began to manifest. During prayer, his eyes frequently filled with tears in a disquieting manner. He felt excruciating pain in his hands and feet, pain that always came accompanied by an inexplicable fragrance, a mixture of roses and incense. As if heaven touched the earth for a moment, he began to wear simple black wool gloves to hide what was starting to appear: wounds. And then, one dawn in September 1918, everything changed forever. In the empty chapel, after the celebration of Mass, Brother Pio remained in deep prayer. The sun had not yet risen. The candlelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, and an almost supernatural silence filled the air. Suddenly, a luminous presence filled the space. Brother Pio fell to his knees. Before him, in ecstasy, he saw the crucified Christ, glorious and bloody. It was at that moment, enveloped in a mystical pain and a love that cannot be put into words, that the wounds appeared. The hands, the feet, and the side began to bleed. It was not a vision. It was torn, open, living flesh, real blood, warm blood. A sweet smell filled the air, as if flowers blossomed from pain. He did not scream, he did not despair. He simply wept. "My Jesus, what have you done to me?" He was alone. Morning had not yet dawned, and there, in the silent cell, Brother Pio became a living altar of the Passion of Christ. In the following days, he tried to hide the wounds. He bandaged them carefully, wore thick socks and gloves so that no one would see, but the blood seeped. It stained the sheets, the altar cloths, his garments. The friars began to notice. They called doctors, superiors, and the news spread quickly. The doctors were perplexed. The wounds did not heal. There was no infection, and strangely, they exuded a delicate fragrance. One of them, skeptical, touched the wounds with a challenging expression, but left the convent with tears in his eyes, and no explanation at all. The church, cautious, began investigations. Brother Pio was interrogated, examined, observed. And even in the face of doubts and the discomfort of being seen as a phenomenon, he remained obedient. "I did not ask for this. I only want to love God." Meanwhile, people began to come from afar. Pilgrims, the sick, the curious. Some came with faith, others with suspicion, but all left touched. Something invisible lingered over that place. There was solace, there was healing, There were tears shed in silence before that friar with downcast eyes, bandaged hands, and a gentle voice. And Brother Pio, he simply continued, ever deeper celebrations, masses that lasted 2-3 hours, marked by long pauses, contained tears and a silence that touched the soul. His pain was visible, but never theatrical. It was authentic cross. It was Christ in living flesh. At the end of each day, he retired to his cell. He washed the blood-stained cloths, said his prayers, and slept with his head resting on the wooden cross. And there, while the world still tried to understand what was happening, a daily miracle occurred. The flesh suffered, but the spirit soared. The now visible wounds were a sign, not of glory, but of union. Brother Pio was no longer just a friar. He had become a living sacrifice, and San Giovanni Rotondo, once forgotten, began to become a sanctuary. Chapter 5, Fame, Miracles, and the Church's Incomprehension. The news of Brother Pio's wounds spread like fire in dry grass. In no time, pilgrims began to climb the dusty trails of San Giovanni Rotondo, many on foot, with rosaries in hand and tears in their eyes. They came from all over Italy, peasants, widows, wounded soldiers from the war, mothers with sick children, all thirsty for comfort, all wanting to see, hear, touch that stigmatized friar. And what they found was not a spectacle, but a simple man, silent, bandaged to the tips of his fingers. His presence commanded reverence. It was enough to enter the church during his Mass to feel something different. A thick, spiritual silence spread. He celebrated as one who sees Christ himself before the altar, each word spoken with pause, with pain, with love. Every gesture was made with the care of someone who deals with the eternal. The healings began to happen. A blind man who regained his sight, a paralyzed child who walked after the blessing, a tumor that disappeared after confession, and perhaps more impactful than all of this, the converted hearts. Hardened men kneeling for the first time in decades. Women leaving Mass with their faces washed in tears, feeling touched by God. But with fame came the shadow. The Church, always cautious in the face of extraordinary phenomena, began to investigate. And in that process, some doubted. Rumors began to circulate. Is it real? Is it hysteria? Could it be a pious hoax? Brother Pio, who never sought recognition, suddenly found himself at the center of a storm of criticism and suspicion. Letters were sent to the Vatican. Doctors were summoned. Reports began to be drafted by priests who had never seen him in person. Ecclesiastical authorities sent secret observers. Some, touched by faith, left San Giovanni converted. Others, bearing the weight of disbelief, drafted cold and distant opinions. And then came the decision that tore the heart of the obedient. Friar, in 1923, the Holy See imposed severe restrictions. Brother Pio could no longer hear confessions in public. His masses would be monitored, and he could not respond to the letters he received, nor speak with the pilgrims. When he received the order, he lowered his head. He fell silent. He did not defend himself. He merely whispered, "Fiat voluntas tua." Obedience would be his cross now. The crowd, outraged, protested, but Brother Pio asked for silence. "Do not speak against the Church. The Church is my mother." Even humiliated, even discredited, even wounded by the very institution he loved so much, he remained faithful. There was never a word of rebellion. Only resignation, prayer, and even more silence. The convent grew emptier again, but Brother Pio's inner cross was heavier. During this period, spiritual attacks intensified. At night, his cell became the scene of true battles. Brothers heard thuds, muffled cries, furniture falling. At dawn, the friar was pale, exhausted, often with new marks on his body. "It's the demons," he said. "They cannot bear what God is doing here." Even so, he never stopped praying. He prayed the rosary dozens of times a day. He cried before the Blessed Sacrament. He asked for strength, not to be freed, but to continue loving. Those years of persecution were like a spiritual desert, where he was tested in the innermost part of his soul, and he passed through the trial, as gold in the fire. Slowly, the Church began to realize that there was something beyond the explainable. New investigations, more honest, closer to reality, revealed a humble man, obedient, full of charity, and without personal ambitions. Brother Pio gained nothing from it. He only suffered for love. The restrictions were gradually softened over time, but the scar of forced silence remained in his heart. Still, when the faithful returned to fill the church, he welcomed them with the same affection as before, like a father who never stopped loving, even when unjustly forgotten. In this chapter of his life, Padre Pio became even more like Christ, misunderstood, persecuted, rejected, but always faithful. And every tear of his, shed in silence in the cold stone convent, was like a new prayer, a prayer that rose to heaven, with the fragrance of the roses that bloomed from his wounds. Chapter 6. Decades of isolation and silent obedience. The bell of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie rang punctually, as always. But now the silence around it was denser. Brother Pio still lived there, still wore the brown habit of the Capuchins, still spent his hours of prayer in the small choir before the Blessed Sacrament. But something had changed. Loneliness was no longer just a physical state. It was an open wound in the heart. In 1931, by order of the Holy Office, Brother Pio was formally prohibited from celebrating public masses and hearing confessions. He was also forbidden to communicate with the public. A cell was assigned to him where he would live confined under surveillance without contact with the pilgrims. The stigmatized friar whom so many sought for comfort was now kept in seclusion like a hidden flame. Upon receiving the news, there was no rebellion, just silence. He closed his eyes for a moment, sighed deeply, and murmured, "The cross of Jesus is my book. I will learn everything there." That cold cell with the small iron window became his school of holiness. The pain was daily. Not only the physical pain of the wounds, which bled incessantly and which he hid with bandages, but the moral pain of being misunderstood by the very church. And yet, he loved her. "The church is my mother, even when she hurts me," he once said to a brother from the convent. The days were long and silent. Brother Pio remained almost always in prayer. The rosary slid through his fingers like a breath. At times, he would kneel for hours, motionless, with his gaze lost on the cross. At other moments, he wrote carefully selected spiritual letters or meditated on the writings of Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, and Francis of Assisi. But the nights were the hardest. Strange voices, thuds against the wall, dark figures. The demons assaulted him violently as if they knew he was vulnerable. The friars reported hearing noises as if furniture were being dragged, objects falling, muffled screams. And in the morning, they found him with a swollen face, red eyes, and bloodied hands. One of the friars even testified, "It was as if he had fought a real battle during the night, and still he smiled at us at dawn." During this time, Brother Pio offered everything, every pain, every humiliation, every sleepless night. "It's for souls," he said. "I accept everything as long as I save at least one more soul." Your body was weakening. The fevers returned. The chest pains intensified, but he remained steadfast, like a candle that burns until the end. Even though he was prevented from celebrating public masses, he was allowed to celebrate in his cell. And there, away from the eyes of the world, the Eucharist became a true Calvary. The words of consecration were spoken softly, amid tears. His wounded hands trembled. The cloth he used to wipe the blood from his wounds became red before the end of the Mass. Once, a curious young friar peeked through a crack in the door during the private celebration. What he saw marked him forever. He was transfigured, as if he were no longer there, as if heaven had descended upon that cell. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the convent, the people did not forget him. Thousands continued to travel to San Giovanni Rotondo. Many stood outside praying, waiting hours for a wave, a blessing from a distance. And even without seeing him, they returned home with renewed hearts. The faith in Padre Pio became deeper, quieter, more rooted in pain. After more than a decade of trials, the Church began to reconsider. Reports of holiness, testimonies of conversions and healings, and the unquestionable example of obedience of Friar Pio touched the hearts of his superiors. Slowly, he was reinstated to ministerial functions, but nothing would be as before. That long decade of isolation had transformed him. He was no longer just the friar with the wounds. He was the friar of fidelity amid injustice, of love for the Church even when the Church wounded him, of silence that speaks louder than 1,000 words. And so at the end of this phase of seclusion, Friar Pio emerged like gold, purified by fire. His hands bled, yes, but his heart shone with the light of true holiness, one that is born not from applause, but from total abandonment to the will of God. Chapter 7, Rehabilitation and Foundation of the Hospital for Relief of Suffering. When heaven finally opened over San Giovanni Rotondo and the prohibitions began to fall, Padre Pio did not exalt himself, did not celebrate, nor did he express satisfaction. He simply bowed his head and thanked silently, as one who receives back something they never stopped loving. His life was once again at the service of the people of God, and even more so, of Mary. Yes, it was the Blessed Mother who inspired in the heart of that frail friar a grand work, a hospital that would not only be a medical center, but a place of hope, faith, and comfort for those who suffer. We must relieve not only the pain of the body, but the anguish of the soul, he said. The seed of what would become the hospital Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, the relief of suffering, was born there. The idea initially seemed absurd. How could a poor reclusive friar without resources found an internationally renowned hospital in an isolated village? But Padre Pio's faith was more solid than cement. If it is God's will, it will happen, he calmly asserted. And then miracles began to align. Donations arrived inexplicably. Rich and simple devotees, Italians and foreigners, offered sums. Engineers and doctors volunteered. A team formed out of love, not profit. The construction began with prayers, daily masses, and the blessing of the friar who observed everything from the window of his cell. He watched every phase of the construction with attentive eyes. Even with constant pain, he descended to see the bricks being laid, prayed over the land, and gave practical and spiritual advice. "This place will be the cathedral of Christian charity," he said, "and each patient will be treated as if they were Christ himself suffering." The hospital was being built like a visible miracle. A solid building in the mountains with a modern structure, airy rooms, and chapels. A place where science and faith walked together. And when it was inaugurated in 1956, tears streamed down the faces of many. The stigmatized friar, who had once been isolated like a burden, now offered the world a gift of mercy. But Padre Pio sought no recognition. He continued to live simply in his cold cell, hearing confessions for up to 15 hours a day. The lines of penitents grew. People came from everywhere, hardened sinners, celebrities, politicians, widowed women with rosaries tightly held in their hands, desperate mothers with sick children. He welcomed them all with a firm gaze and words that tore at the soul but healed the heart. "Confess sincerely. God already knows everything, but he needs your humility, he said. Many times he revealed sins that the penitent had omitted. And what about that person you offended in 1939? The sinner would pale. They would fall into tears. It was as if Christ himself was speaking through that friar. As the hospital flourished, the spiritual world around Padre Pio continued to boil. Phenomena like bilocation, being in two places at once, became increasingly frequent. People reported seeing him in their hospital rooms, in war trenches, in moments of despair, and he would later confirm with a slight smile, "I was there with you. Do not fear." But not everything was light. The cross never abandoned him. Physical pains intensified. He had difficulties walking, eating. The stigmata bled even more, and he offered everything more and more for the church, for souls, for priests. To the younger friars he taught to love suffering with sweetness. We must not flee from the cross. The cross is a kiss from Jesus. Padre Pio saw his hospital functioning, his mission expanding, but his body, like a consumed candle, was fading in silence. Still, he never allowed himself to be consumed by vanity. He never considered his work as his own. It was God's, it was Mary's, and he was just a wounded servant, but faithful until the end. In the center of the hospital, he had a chapel built. "Here is the heart," he said, because he knew that without prayer, no remedy would truly heal. And there, before the crucifix, amidst prayers and pains, his heart continued to burn like incense before God. Chapter 8. Last year's Glory and Holy Death. The years went by, and Father Pio's body carried time with a silent dignity. His face became more wrinkled, his eyes deeper, his hands more fragile, but the wounds, still alive, continued to bleed with the same intensity as always. Each step was a sacrifice. The pain in his knees prevented him from walking steadily. Sometimes he needed to be carried to the altar, but he never stopped celebrating. He never stopped hearing confessions. He never stopped loving. In the 1950s and 1960s, San Giovanni Rotondo transformed. Once a forgotten village, it was now a world pilgrimage site. Hundreds of thousands of people came every year, some dragging themselves, others in deep silence, bringing offerings, requests, tears. The small convent could no longer accommodate the crowd. And Father Pio, even exhausted, welcomed everyone with the same patience as always, sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with severity, but always with truth. His gaze pierced through the masks. Many entered the confessional with arrogance and left on their knees sobbing. "The Lord expects true repentance from you," he would say in a gentle yet cutting voice. His mission as a confessor became his final stronghold, an invisible battlefield where souls were saved with each word spoken. Amid the groans of his wounded body, the graces multiplied. A barren woman became pregnant after a blessing. A lost child returned home after a confession made in his mother's name. A dying person on the brink of death received comfort in an unexpected apparition. And among the reports, the same scent lingered: roses, lilies, myrrh, the fragrance of heaven's presence. But there was also hidden agony. Sleepless nights, fevers that wouldn't yield, pains that were not just physical but spiritual. "The devil still haunts me," he confessed to a friar. "They cannot bear that I celebrate. They cannot bear that I love." In 1968, Father Pio was 81 years old. More than 50 of those years bearing in body and soul the sufferings of the cross. He could no longer walk alone. To celebrate Mass, he needed to lean on the brothers. The altar was his daily Golgotha, and each Eucharist became a deep dive into the Passion. On September 22nd, he celebrated his last public Mass. The church was packed. The candles flickered. The air felt denser, as if something holy were about to happen. Father Pio was visibly weakened. His eyes, however, shone with a mysterious peace. As he raised the host, his trembling hands held the body of Christ with the firmness of one who holds an eternal secret. People were crying. They knew deep in their souls that it was goodbye. In the early hours of September 23rd, between 2 and 3 in the morning, Father Pio's cell was silent. A young friar who was discreetly keeping watch entered carefully. He found the saint lying down, breathing with difficulty. His face was calm. His hands, covered in gauze, rested on his chest. His lips murmured a final word: Jesus, Mary. And then, gently, like a candle that extinguishes noiselessly, Father Pio departed. At the moment of his death, the wounds disappeared from his body. They simply vanished, as if they had never existed. The body was intact, with no wounds, just a slight smile on his lips. The scent of flowers filled the room. Outside, a group of pilgrims began, unknowingly, to spontaneously pray the rosary. The news spread like lightning. Men and women rushed into the streets, crying as if they had lost a father. The city fell silent. It was as if time had stopped. And on that day, not just a friar died, a living altar died, a channel between heaven and earth. In the following days, over 100,000 people passed by his body. Men who had never cried sobbed before his coffin. Women pressed rosaries against his now unblemished hands, filled with grace. The funeral was a collective prayer, a cry of faith, a procession of hope. Father Pio died as he lived, in silence, in obedience in the cross, but his death was not the end. It was a beginning. Since then, millions have turned to him. Miracles continue, prayers are answered, and his presence, like the fragrance of incense, still lingers over the world. There, on the mountain where he was once persecuted and humiliated, now rests the body of one who chose to love, even without being understood. The one who made suffering a gift, the one who, even in dying, never left. Now is the moment for silence and reflection. After knowing step by step the life marked by the cross and grace of Father Pio, we open space for prayer. This prayer is not a hasty request, it is a meeting, a deep dive into the intercession of the saint of the hidden wounds. Prepare your heart, take a deep breath, and imagine yourself before the cell where he lived, feeling the light scent of incense, hearing the distant bells, the echo of footsteps in the cloister, and the sound of the rosary being prayed amid tears. Sit in silence. Touch your heart with your hand. Imagine he is there by your side. Dear Father, you who shaped the soul of Saint Padre Pio with the fire of your cross, teach us also to love in suffering and to trust in the dark. Padre Pio, man, hidden in the silence of cold stones, man marked in body with the wounds of Christ, teach us to accept what we do not understand, to endure the nights of anguish, and to offer everything, even without an answer. You who carried in your heart the pain of others, who heard confessions with tears and patience, look at us now. Look at our lost children, at our estranged husbands, at our silent diseases and our deep loneliness. You who said, pray, wait, and do not worry. Teach us to do that with firm faith. Teach us to be silent without revolt, to love without demands, to trust even when the ground disappears beneath our feet. Padre Pio, doctor of weary souls, heals in us the root of sadness. Restore in us the desire for holiness. Blow over us your fragrance of peace, the one that so many felt before your hidden wounds. Intercede for us with Christ. Pray for this heart that today prays in tears, for this woman who cannot sleep from pain, for this elderly person who waits for an answer, for this soul that has just begun to speak with God again. Pray for our families, for our grandchildren, who grew up far from the faith, for those who left without saying goodbye, and for those who remained carrying nameless crosses. You who saw the invisible, who were persecuted by the church and yet loved it, grant us this courage to continue, this inexplicable faithfulness, this surrender that transforms suffering into blessing. Dear Padre Pio, lift your eyes for us. Show us the face of Mary, guide us to the heart of Jesus, and at the hour of our death, come to meet us with your rosary in hand and your voice whispering, Jesus, Mary, Jesus, Mary. Amen.